guys, so today we're talking about a show that means like so much to me that I have just fallen in love with since watching, and that's Fellow Travellers, which obviously, as you can see, it's on the wall behind me, clearly one of my favourites. But yeah, I still don't even know how to fully articulate my personal feelings on the show, other than that like something shifted for me watching it. It is a beautiful show, it's devastating, heartbreaking, but also just one of the most beautiful things I think I've ever watched. I thought I had to talk about it. It's also such a rich show, there's so much to cover, so I really thought that talking about it would be a great video, hopefully. But yeah, so we'll start with a quick kind of brief overview of the show. Fellow Travellers follows a few gay men, primarily our main characters Tim and Hawk, throughout 4 decades spanning from the 50s through to the 80s, and just the gay experience of that time, the politics of the time, the discrimination, the prejudice, all of the awful treatment that queer people had to face during this period of time. It is based technically on the novel of the same name by Thomas Mellon and was written by Ron Nicewanner, who did a fantastic job. The writing in the show is fantastic. I will start right there. The writing is phenomenal. Again, it's a beautiful show. I feel like I'll say that like 20 times. Also, I think something quite nice to mention about the show is all of the main cast are gay, most of the cast and crew in general are, and that is, I think that shows in watching the series, as I think there's a certain level of care that was given to this material that could only be done by people that relate to it personally. I think it really helps, like, you feel just like how important the show is, the significance of the events of it, and also the personal connection to it. But so I'm going to start by giving a rough overview of each decade we cover and the political context of each time, because I do think the show really relies on that to build out how our characters behave, their choices, how they react, is all due to that context. So we start in the 50s with McCarthyism and the Lavender Scare, which is a very interesting time. This is, post World War II, and the idea of being anti-communist and anti-Soviet is all the US government really cares about. And so as a part of Red Scare propaganda and McCarthyism, we have the Lavender Scare, which is probably the lesser known part of this, which was the idea that within government agencies they were essentially hunting down any queer person to have them fired, removed from their government post, because they were essentially lumping this in as being gay or queer, as being anti-communist, and therefore a threat to American democracy. They would label these people as subversives, and they would really just dig into their lives in the most invasive, gross ways. Also perpetrated several homophobic stereotypes, obviously, about gay people being dangerous, and yeah, just a genuinely horrific witch hunt, essentially. Resulted in an average of 1 suicide per week into these people they were investigating, people having to resign the threat of their whole lives being uprooted simply because they were gay is wildly disturbing, obviously. And yeah, we see a lot of these investigations. We see polygraph exams. We also see discussions of conversion therapy as well as a part of this time period. And yeah, in general, a really gross witch hunt of people simply because they're gay. I mean, I don't need to really say how gross and disturbing that is. Okay, so I'd say for the 60s, we're talking about like the Vietnam War protests, although there isn't like a whole, like the story doesn't really focus on that too much. The main reason we talk about that is because Tim actively participates in those protests and is running from the law. But there's the backdrop for the 60s, but I think that this is probably the least important contextually to the story of our characters, but it obviously should be mentioned. So for the 70s, the backdrop for this time is gay liberation, Fire Island. This is like kind of the first time we see like gay freedom and joy in like a wider scope. It's not limited to the small spaces that we see it in the earlier stages of the series and in the previous decades. However, we also do see that like the fight is obviously not over. We see the death of Harvey Milk and the protests following that and police brutality following that as well. So we kind of have the juxtaposition of those two things of where the gay community has gained so much. They have far more freedom than they have had in the previous 2 decades, but there's also that the fight has not ended. It's nowhere near being over, as we know in the present. But yeah, definitely is a nice change of pace for the series in that their context is, you know, a little bit lighter around everything. Then we get to the 80s, and obviously we're talking about the AIDS crisis, and this is definitely probably one of the heavier things the show has to cover for obvious reasons. You know, the obvious deaths and illness and all of that awful part, and also the government negligence and cruelty and the kind of refusal to really care about all of these people. They're dying from an illness. It's awful in that sense. I do want to quickly mention, I think the show does a really good job of showing us kind of the reality of living with AIDS as we see Tim dealing with that, but without like hyper focusing on it in like a gratuitous manner, because I do think it would be quite easy to like really focus on certain things and make it feel like a little excessive, versus we just see it as Tim is living with this illness. Obviously that is a big part of his life, but isn't all Tim becomes, which I think is important. But yeah, the main thing here too is the lack of government support for those with AIDS and the discrimination against giving the correct care to those people, despite the fact that they desperately needed it. So now I'm going to get on to talking about our 2 main characters, Hawkins Fuller and Tim Laughlin. We follow them from the very beginning, so we start with them meeting. I don't really know what happened to this clip, but I was just saying that Hawkins meet at an election party on the night of Eisenhower's election as president. So yeah, back to that. I really don't know what happened there. Very quickly it's clear that like there's some attraction there, but it's a very brief meeting, and then soon they end up in a relationship. Hawk helps Tim get a job in the State Department working under McCarthy, and so very quickly we watch their relationship develop, and they have a very interesting relationship in that the power dynamic between the two of them is ever changing. There's very few times where it really stays the same, which I think is interesting considering when we first meet Tim and Hawk, it's very easy to assume that Hawk would have the power in their relationship almost always, but we very quickly see that moving between the two of them almost immediately. Actually, I feel in episode 1 we already see that shift. But the main way that the show displays the change in their power dynamics is through the use of sex, primarily because during this time in the 50s, when, you know, these gay men are having to hide, most of their relationships only have sex involved. That becomes the core of it because they have such a limited time and space to operate within to live their true selves, that they have to kind of only work within the most extreme version of their relationship in the purest form of it. But so I do think the sex in the show is very important, I think done very well, as we see Hawke and Tim's power play constantly shifting through that lens. I do want to quickly though, while we are talking about the use of sex in the show to tell the story, which I do think again is done exceptionally well, is one of my issues watching some of the discussion around the show is the weird hyperfixation on it, and like getting to a point where it feels like that some people, it's all they gain from the show is that they show a lot of sex in it, which is not the point. The point is that that's the bounds in which their relationship could operate most of the time. And I think it's vital to the story. The story and their relationship would be almost impossible to understand without those things. But I have noticed some people kind of focusing on it in a very strange way. I did just want to mention that because I think it is very weird and uncomfortable when it's just a story device. It's an important one. It's an important function to Hawke and Tim's relationship and the power that we watch shift between the two of them. So to quickly talk about how Hawke versus Tim kind of exist in the world during this time, so during the 50s. Hawke outwardly is pretty like your typical like overly confident and who like knows what he's doing. He's like kind of everything's planned out. He's also maybe a touch cold outwardly. You don't see a lot of Hawke's personal opinions ever. He's very kind of vague with people as like a way to hide himself as much as possible for no one to ask questions. And he has these very strict boundaries with which his relationships usually operate. We see at the very beginning that like normally with men he will lie about his name and he essentially wants to have sex and be done, and almost immediately we see him break those rules for Tim. He, immediately Tim goes and finds out who Hawke is, and so when they meet again in the park, Tim already knows, but Hawke doesn't try to really hide from Tim in the same way that he does with everyone else. It's immediately clear that, I don't know whether he has more trust in Tim or what, but he otherwise operates in these very strict boundaries and is often quite cold, and we do see that become a point of conflict for him with Tim, because Tim is the opposite. I think partly due to his youth in comparison to Hawke, he is very optimistic, probably quite naive as well, but like he truly believes in the goodness of people. He's someone who has real convictions. He's very devoted to his politics and his religion, and we really see that become the inner conflict for Tim throughout the entire show, is how he can both be true to himself and his gayness and his queerness, but also still be devoted to God, which is the one thing he's really trusted and believed in this whole time, as well as his politics and his devotion to McCarthy. And again, his politics that also kind of oppose who he is truly. Tim has really interesting, set of beliefs that kind of all should contradict, and he's constantly trying to figure out which one's the best to believe in, but also perhaps like can those align in any sense. I also do think that as we progress throughout the decades and we watch his relationship with Hawke, that his relationship with religion often mirrors his love for Hawke, because he even says it in the final scene of that we see him speak to Hawke the last time we see them together. He even talks about how his love for God and his love for Hawke, he kind of treats the same way towards the end of his life, because he loves both of them completely regardless of whether that love is returned. But it's very interesting to watch from the beginning where Tim is constantly in conflict with himself. You see him feel immense guilt and shame due to, the values of the church directly opposing who he is, and the love that he feels for Hawke that feels like the right thing to him. But then the thing he's devoted all of his life to says that is wrong. And that conflict, I think, is very interesting and becomes central to both Tim individually, but also to his relationship with Hawke, as Hawke has already decided the boundaries that he operates within, as I already mentioned. And it's very interesting to watch the dichotomy of Hawke being, cold and having these set rules for himself versus Tim just wanting complete love and devotion to something or to someone. So I'm going to go in chronological order of what happens, not the order that the show shows it in, because after Tim and Hawke have like the early stages of their relationship, Tim eventually enlists in the army after Hawke says he is going to get engaged to Lucy. And we see them kind of split off to try and, stay functioning within the world in the ways that they choose to, even if that means abandoning their relationship to try and keep the rest of their lives held together. In the early stages of the show, we are kind of made to believe that after Tim and Hawke last see each other before Tim leaves the army, that they don't see each other again until we see them in the 60s and Tim is on the run. But in the final episode of the show, we see that actually Hawke and Tim did see each other again in the late 50s after Tim has been in the army. And I think this is probably my personal favourite time for their relationship, primarily because I think it's the most balanced version of their relationship that we see. After his time in the army, I think Tim is more self-assured and stable within himself, especially in comparison to the early stages of Tim, who he's far more emotional, far more reliant on Hawke a lot of the time in their relationship, and he really wants so much from Hawke that Hawke is clearly not ready to give. But in the late 50s, as we see Tim, he no longer feels as reliant on Hawke. He still clearly loves him, but therefore he's willing to have a relationship with him, but within Hawke's boundaries. This is, I think, where Tim seems to be okay with Hawke's boundaries that he's set, because at least then he can still have him. And I also think this is an interesting time for Hawke, because while Hawke is for the most part unchanged from the early 50s when we see him to the late 50s, his life didn't change that much on a basic material level, but within his relationship with Tim, it's very clear that he's now willing to cede at least some power to him in their relationship, which again, that the scene of them with the milk clearly shows that. So it shows that Hawke is willing to now give more power to Tim, versus before it was very rare for Hawke to really want to do that. I also think too, going back to Tim quickly in the late 50s, is that he talks to Mary about no longer trusting in false idols, and he seems at this point to not be searching for complete devotion to something in the same way anymore. He's okay with, he just seems in general more stable, he doesn't need to be completely devoted to something. But I do think that this is interesting to go back and see him in the late 50s like this after his time in the army, because later in his life, again, like the 60s, 70s and 80s, we see that he again is searching to be completely devoted for something. So it's only really this small period of time where he at least outwardly seems like he is not searching in the same way that he was previously or later. So during this time in the late 50s, we see, again, this really quite nice, more balanced version of Hawke and Tim's relationship. Hawke is helping Tim get a job again, but it's more equal footing. Tim has more life experience now and understands that the world isn't as good as he wanted to believe it to be earlier on. And Hawke, is now willing to put more trust in Tim. However, as we see, Hawke's now married to Lucy and he's trying to kind of build the perfect life. You could see it slowly work out for him that if Tim gets a job at the State Department as his colleague now, that puts his private life with Tim and the perfect life he's trying to build openly too close together for his liking. They're too close to intersecting for Hawke's comfort. And this, of course, causes Hawke to commit the ultimate betrayal to Tim at that time of reporting him to the M Unit, which is the unit that was investigating gay people at this time. And I think it's so interesting to see that when we do in the show, because we don't see any of this time frame until episode 8 in the final episode, because you are kind of left wondering why we first see Tim in the 60s. He's so reluctant to see Hawke, like he's not thrilled to have to see him at all, but he's desperate during that time, as we'll talk about. But I also do think seeing Tim, after the birth of Hawke's son Jackson, Tim going to the hospital and seeing the baby, and for Tim, I think that moment really puts it into perspective. Like, that Hawke has made his choice. He's chosen the outward perfect life, not a life with Tim, even though I think, like, Tim says he is willing to operate within Hawke's boundaries, but I do think there is still a part of him there that's hoping that Hawke would choose differently. In the 60s, I think it's a really interesting, but also quite strange part of Hawke and Tim's relationship, because it's very clear Tim was trying to avoid Hawke at all costs. I think during that, because of what happened in the late 50s, Tim does not really want anything to do with Hawke, but he's desperate due to his participation in war protests. He is on the run from the police for burning like enlistment papers, which is obviously a federal crime. So he kind of has to go to Hawke. It's the only option he has. But it's a very strange time in their relationship, because I think Hawke is kind of hoping that Tim will be willing to rekindle their relationship in whatever terms he sets again. But Tim, for one, is now celibate because he is currently in seminary and, looking to become a priest. And he's, back to being wholeheartedly devoted to religion and willing to kind of give up everything else for it. But yeah, he's now gone back to being completely devoted to something, and that is religion. And this time, Hawke can't pull him away from it in the same way as he could when they first met, because Tim now knows what it's like to be betrayed by Hawke, and that ultimately he doesn't really win in this situation if he goes back to him. And it's very interesting how, while Tim has decided to choose religion in this way, Hawke is really, at least he says he's really doubling down on choosing his family, this family that he's built, this more traditional, perfect ideal. It's very interesting to see Hawke kind of saying he's very devoted to that while still obviously seeing men. There's clearly, he's not going to stop doing that under any circumstances. But you kind of, I think at one point you see Hawke kind of saying he's devoted to his family as a defense against feeling rejected by the fact that Tim will not choose him over religion this time. But in the same breath, we also see like Tim at one point watching Hawke and his family through the window, and him like longing for a life with Hawke still. And you can tell it really takes a lot for him to reject Hawke and say, I'm more devoted to religion than you this time. And using religion also, I think, as a way to avoid falling back into a relationship with Hawke that ultimately doesn't end super well for him, as we've seen 2 times already throughout the 50s. I also do just want to mention quickly that I don't think Hawke or Tim's love for each other is less during this period of time. I just think they are so desperately trying to cling to the other things that they have chosen as like a coping mechanism and as a way to distract themselves from the fact that they can't be together because of the choices they've made, primarily the choices Hawke has made. And so their love hasn't changed, it's just they're desperately trying to, I think for Tim, avoid it because he knows he will get hurt anyway, even though he would love to live in a version of events where he can be devoted to Hawke and that not be harmful to him in the way that it has been previously. Now we've reached the 70s, and I think the 70s is very interesting for the fact that Tim is now the one who is stable. Tim is now he's very stable within himself and his job and his life. He's come out to everyone in his life. He's now openly gay. He's living his life, the most freely that he ever has. He's also now working as like a clinical social worker and working with gay patients and helping them through the aftermath of things like conversion therapy and all of the other awful parts of this experience during this time. Yes, a time where we see Tim's really come into himself and is fully stable with himself. This is, I think, interesting for Hawke and Tim's dynamic, because this is the first time we see Tim in a more stable position than Hawke, and it's probably a truer stability than what Hawke has ever had, because Tim at this point, he is stable because he is now living a life that is true to himself, whereas Hawke's previous supposed stability came from him hiding and the walls he had put around himself and the clear boundaries he had set for his life. So then we see Hawke during this time in the 70s is not doing well. Let's just get straight to that. Hawke is really not well at this point. He's at his most vulnerable at this point in time. His son Jackson has passed away. He obviously really is struggling with, so he starts to rely on drugs and alcohol and sex to numb himself and to ignore his grief. And he then eventually abandons his family. Lucy and his daughter are now kind of left while they're also still grieving, and Hawke has gone off to party and ignore his grief. However, we clearly see that whenever he needs someone, he only will call Tim. The only person he really goes to is Tim, and obviously this is how they reconnect during this time, as he sends him a postcard and just says, "Skippy, I need you." Obviously Tim is willing to go to him this time. I think, again, perhaps because Tim is more stable with himself, he's willing to go to Hawke during this time, and also because I do think ultimately he is more devoted to Hawke, I think, than he would claim to be at this time. And also because I think he just genuinely loves and cares for Hawke, and there's no way he would not go see him when he really needs someone like this. We clearly see too during this time that Tim is the only one Hawke trusts with anything. The fact that the other people he's around, like he's currently with this guy Craig, but then Craig didn't even know about his son dying, and so we see that the only person that truly knows Hawke really is Tim, and that's why that's the only person Hawke will call. And then unfortunately, at the end of this kind of stint in the 70s, we see, Hawke kind of say that he will get better, that he wants to get better after that truly devastating scene when they're having the threesome with Craig, and then he sees the picture of Jackson and it all hits Hawke at once. The devastation of it all, and him asking Tim to let him die, that entire just heart-wrenching scene. But we see afterwards Hawke kind of saying to Tim that he wants to get better, and then unfortunately the next day he's doing drugs again. And I think the thing that really forces Hawke to actually get his shit together is Tim saying, "I'm done, I'm leaving, I can't deal with this." There's nothing he can really say or do to make this better. You need to get help. I can't stay and watch this anymore. So then we have finally reached the 80s, and obviously at this point Tim has AIDS. He is, dying. He's very clearly, severely ill at this point. And Hawke kind of shows up despite the fact that Tim doesn't really want him there, or at least he claims he doesn't. But I do think it's quite nice that this is, I suppose, the first time we see Hawke show up for Tim in a more equal capacity. I feel like this is Hawke actually trying to give more of himself and more of his effort to Tim in a way he wasn't willing to earlier. We want to see moments where they kind of behave like an old married couple. There's something really sweet and nice about that, finally seeing them have those kind of moments. And we also, I think, watch Hawke reckon with the fact that he will actually lose Tim, that, you know, this disease will eventually, you know, will take Tim from him. There's no avoiding that, and so I think that's also why Hawke finally probably gives more of himself emotionally and more of his time, because this is the first time we see him prioritize Tim above the other things in his life, because I think he's fully grasping the fact that, like, Tim doesn't have a lot of time left. Also, the 80s, like, despite the awful context of the 80s, the devastation of it, it really is so much of the best moments of Hawke and Tim. You know, it's also the first kind of time we see Hawke actively defend Tim at the gala, where, you know, Tim's hoping to get a bill signed to help with care for those with AIDS. And it's, you know, also the first time Hawke even goes out in public with Tim properly. You know, this really marks a change in Hawke, that he's willing to go out with Tim, that he, you know, kisses him in public even, that he defends him. You know, this is the first time where Hawke kind of gives the open, true relationship to Tim that Tim's always been searching for from him. And then, obviously, we see that final scene of Tim and Hawke at the gala, which is beautiful and devastating and a million things. I don't know if I'll ever be able to get through watching it without feeling so much. But we see Tim kind of choosing to devote the last of his life to activism, and therefore letting go of Hawke in the process. You know, he says that he only wants to be devoted to and focused on one singular thing, and that has to be activism, and in the process he can set Hawke free, and Hawke can go do and be whatever he wants. However, unknown to Tim is that Lucy has left Hawke. She has said she's done, and we will talk more shortly about Lucy and Hawke and their dynamic, and like what Hawke's choices have meant for her, so I'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, we see Lucy leave Hawke before this conversation with Tim. So Hawke is left with practically no one at the end. It's pretty devastating that he's finally, you know, willing to, you know, be out with Tim and accept himself and all of these things, but, you know, the consequences of all of his prior choices, that he's actually left with nobody. And then the final scene of the show, I don't know if I'll ever be able to watch the scene without crying. We see like that beautiful, heart-wrenching, just incredible final scene of the AIDS quilt and Hawke going and finding like Tim's square, and it's the first time he like states his love for Tim out loud, and that's by saying it to his daughter, like, you know, Tim wasn't his friend, that's the man I loved. And that moment is, you know, both so beautiful and important that Hawke finally was able to say that, but in the same breath, like, so deeply sad, the fact that the first time that Hawke is finally comfortable with that, he has, the only person there that's left is his daughter. Now for my more general thoughts overall about Tim and Hawke's relationship, I think it is beautiful, and I feel like I've said beautiful like a million times in this video. There's really no other way to describe this show or the story. But yeah, I think Hawke and Tim's dynamic is so interesting. I think we see, you know, someone who's desperately trying to protect himself in Hawke, who, sorry, just scrolling my notes as always, but yeah, I think Hawke has such, you know, harsh set boundaries, as I've already mentioned, and then Tim is someone who we see it starts so much like hope and joy, and his, you know, complete devotion to things is, I think, what makes his character so compelling. And I think, yeah, somewhere on the way, like, yeah, despite how differently they kind of exist within the world and the way they cope with their circumstances, they are able to meet in the middle in a really, again, beautiful way, and in a way that's really important, I think, to watch. Yeah, I like, still with the show, like, I feel like I've watched it multiple times, I love it, like, I don't even have words for it still, how much I love it. I'm going to get a tattoo of like beyond measure, because I think that is such an important phrase of like Tim's ultimate devotion to things, and there's something about that that I really love. And I also just love the show and want it like permanently marked on me forever. But anyway, yeah, this Hawke and Tim's relationship is so complex and interesting, and ultimately they both truly did love each other in a way that, you know, is decade spanning, and, you know, they really clung to it even when it was nearly impossible to do so. And also, I also have to mention that Matt Bomer and Jonathan Bailey did a fantastic job with these characters, and like there's so many moments of it, and just in general that they just really, I don't even know how to like articulate what the two of them achieved in their performances, these characters. I feel like you just know if you watch it. And yeah, I'm so grateful that the two of them were the ones to embody these two characters that are so important and interesting and complicated. So I do briefly want to talk about Hawke and Lucy, because Hawke's, you know, choices with both Tim and Lucy affect their lives permanently, and in a very, yeah, it's very consequential, their interactions with and their separate loves for Hawke. Obviously, so Hawke chooses Lucy, chooses to eventually get married and have a family with her solely so he can keep hiding himself. I do think he probably does love her on some level, like at the very least has a lot of respect for her, loves her family that kind of took him in, but there's also just like, you know, he's not in love with her in the way that she desperately wants and also does deserve to have. Obviously, so her life is then kind of marked by the fact that like she misses out on so many experiences and feelings of like love and desire and true passion with someone, because Hawke ultimately isn't going to feel that for her, even if he does care about her, because he chose this as a mode of survival, not because he really wanted that. And also, we see throughout the show, but especially in the early parts of their relationship, that, you know, the threat of Hawke choosing Lucy in order to protect himself crushes Tim. Tim has such a complete love and devotion to Hawke, and Hawke making that choice breaks Tim's heart, essentially. It's very interesting because we see like Tim keeps asking Hawke if he's going to propose to Lucy, and Hawke gets very defensive and angry during these questions, but Tim's so desperate to just have answers to prepare himself, I think. And then versus that, like Hawke eventually does choose Lucy, but only out of what he feels to be necessity. And we also then see that Lucy does find out about Tim and Hawke pretty earlier than I think I was expecting to see. But we learn in the late 50s that, you know, Tim leaves Hawke a letter, but Lucy's the one that finds it, and then she burns it. So there's these gaps in like what Tim and Hawke know of their feelings for each other, because Hawke doesn't know that Tim obviously left the letter, and Tim doesn't know that Hawke hasn't read it. And so when we see them again in the 60s, they, you know, there's something about the way they interact that's a little stilted in those moments, and I think that's a result of there being these gaps that they don't know are there until, as Tim is leaving after calling to turn himself in, when Lucy says that she burned the letter and Hawke never read it. We also then see later on Lucy accepting what marriage to Hawke means, because she loves the life they built. Ultimately, she loves their home and their family and their children, and she's, you know, has come to terms with that and accepted that to have those things she has had to miss out on a true passion and desire within her marriage. But finally in the 80s we see her eventually end it and, you know, say to Hawke, like, really make him understand that there were consequences for her too, that she lost things as well because of his choices. Like, he wasn't the only one making a sacrifice. I also find it very interesting when we see Lucy and Tim interact in the 80s. We see that they clearly have like a mutual respect and understanding with one another in regards to Hawke and the circumstances he has placed them both in through his choices, you know, that he believed to be necessary. I do want to talk about how there have been people who have wanted to really villainize Hawke throughout this show, but ultimately we cannot judge any of these characters based solely on their actions, because they were just making the choices they thought were going to keep them alive, keep them safe, you know, really hold together whatever they can. And even if, yeah, those choices aren't great, like Hawke makes choices that are really unfortunate for both Tim and Lucy especially, but we can't really, you know, we can't condemn him for it because he felt it was necessary to do so to protect himself, you know, because in a world that, you know, is out to get him. And, you know, we find out more about, you know, Hawke when he was younger and why he's estranged from his family, because they found out about him and Kenny, like his first love, and, you know, he's always experienced, you know, part of what could happen if he doesn't hide everything. So, you know, I can't ever blame Hawke for the choices he made to try and protect himself, even though it, you know, Lucy will never know what it's like to be in a truly loving, passionate marriage, and Tim, you know, missed out on almost all of his life actually having the love of his life there. You know, he only had these small snippets with years in between them. Okay, also my lighting has changed. It's because it's now raining and I can't be bothered setting up my extra lights, so if the lighting has changed in this video, sorry. But anyway, now I want to talk about Marcus and Frankie, who have not been talked about enough in general when people talk about fellow travellers. I do not understand why we have not seen more people talk about Marcus and Frankie's story. I think is so important, and even more probably unique story to see than Hawke and Tim, because we have seen white gay couples discussed before, even though the way that this show covers that is far more extensive and expansive than I've seen before, and I think most people have seen before. But we do need to talk about Marcus and Frankie as well, because I think they are very important to the series. First of all, Jelani Aladdin and Noah Ricketts do a phenomenal job as Marcus and Frankie. Again, can we please give them more credit for this, because they did a great job. I guess the difference for Marcus and Frankie's relationship is the obvious intersection of race and sexuality that they have to fight. You know, Hawke and Tim are, you know, having to hide in a very vulnerable position as two white gay men, and also because of their government positions. But Marcus and Frankie have to fight on two fronts essentially, and that they are both black and also gay, and that intersection is obviously a dangerous one to be at during the time that the series shows. And even now, that's still, you know, still not the safest thing. I think the main thing we see throughout the show is their different approaches to their fight and their activism, and, you know, their relationship with being both black and gay. Because for Marcus, he kind of views it as he has to choose one. He can only win one fight at once. And for him, he's like, the first thing people see when they look at me is a black man, therefore that's the fight I have to choose. Versus, I think Frankie perhaps has a better understanding of how those intersect and cross over, and how it's necessary to fight it on a whole and, you know, work towards that a goal more collectively versus just choosing one or the other. And I don't think either way is wrong. I think some people probably would want to say that Marcus is being unreasonable in his choices, but it is a difficult place to be in if you have to, you know, are fighting on two fronts. You're trying to defend yourself from so many directions that I completely understand why he is so committed to just choosing one. You know, and he wants to make his dad proud. He wants to prove that he can be a successful reporter and writer as a black man. That, you know, for him there are moments where it feels like being gay as well is almost inconvenient to that fight. But I really don't think we can floor him for that. Even though I do think Frankie's more joint activism is, you know, it's more progressive. I think it is more self-accepting as well. Like, we don't really ever see Frankie try to fight himself in any way, in the same way that I think all of our other characters do. I also think it's very interesting to compare Marcus and Hawke, because I do think they somewhat act as mirrors to each other. However, as we see, Marcus makes the braver choice by, you know, consistently kind of choosing Frankie over and over, to the point that, like, when we see them in the 80s and even in the 70s, we see it like they are living together, like they are out and together, and they have built a life for themselves, whereas Hawke gave that up, as we have discussed already. I do think it's interesting to talk about Marcus and Hawke, because obviously they begin in the same place of, you know, purely just sex. This is a need I need to deal with, and then outside of that I don't really want anything to do with being gay, because I have other things I need to focus on, versus like Frankie and Tim having their, you know, Frankie and Tim are probably the braver ones in reality, because they are willing to fight if it means that they can love openly, and they are devoted to the things they care about in a way that Hawke and Marcus aren't willing to be, at least in the beginning. But then, you know, Marcus and Hawke, as I have already said, mirror each other, but then also we kind of watch the two diverging paths you could choose, where Marcus eventually does choose to fight that fight and to be with Frankie, while Hawke is still too scared and ultimately chooses a life that makes him unhappy, makes Lucy unhappy, and deeply hurts Tim. And then in the 70s, we see Frankie and Marcus take in Jerome, who is a student of Marcus's, and he's also a young gay black man. And it's quite interesting to see like the generational differences between Jerome and then Marcus and Frankie. And then also we see in the 80s that Jerome tests positive for AIDS, and it shows like a different side of that experience as well, because obviously Tim is later in his life reckoning with this, and is at the later stages of having that illness, and, you know, he knows that time is running out, whereas for Jerome he's so young, and it's reckoning with the fact that he's, you know, still kind of coming into himself and now has to reckon with this disease. And also the scene where Jerome tells Marcus that he tested positive is probably one of my favourite scenes in the show. It is devastating, and also, like, again, I need a different word, but beautiful. That's the only word I have for anything in this show. But it really is, like, Marcus, like, just saying over and over that you are innocent to Jerome, like, despite the fact that the world will tell you otherwise, that as a gay man, as a black man, you are, you know, you are dangerous, you are wrong, and, you know, the world is going to be so cruel to you, but, like, at the core of it, they are wrong. Like, you are innocent, you are not the one who needs to change or hide, and that you are ultimately undeserving of what is happening to you. Like, this is not your fault. I think it is, yeah, one of the most important moments of the show. And again, just a really devastating but also incredible scene. So for my final thoughts, I obviously just want to say again, I absolutely love Fellow Travellers. I think this is one of the most important shows I've seen maybe ever. You know, I don't think we've ever been able to see, you know, a gay love story like this told so expansively and extensively. You know, we get 8 hours of it. And I think too, with so much diversity amongst those stories, because we have both Hawk and Tim and Marcus and Frankie, you know, we really do get to see all these like nuanced, interesting perspectives, and how every person's experience is so unique, but also there are, you know, certain things that kind of stay the same across everyone, and the different ways to cope and survive through these, you know, really difficult times, and where like just loving someone is threatened. And unfortunately, you know, there are places in the world currently where it is still this way, that can still unfortunately relate to these characters. Like, despite for a lot of us the world improving, in the same breath it hasn't improved for everyone. But yeah, I just love this show. I cannot stress enough that every single person needs to watch it and really sit with this. And yeah, I will be forever changed by watching Fellow Travelers, and I cannot recommend it enough. I think, yeah, it's just, again, keyword of the fucking videos, it's just the most beautiful show I've ever seen, and I love it so deeply and could talk about it forever, as I probably have in this video, to be honest. But I could go on and on for so much longer. There are so many little nuances that I could talk about just each episode, but I already have talked for so long in this video. I'm terrified to see how much footage I have to edit, but for this show, I mean, I don't think you could talk about it too much. I really don't think it's possible to do that, because I think it's just so important, and we should keep talking about this story and other LGBTQIA plus stories. I hope that a show like this having so much success means that more things like it are made, and we can see more nuanced, interesting perspectives on the gay experience, on the queer experience, and yeah, to give, yeah, it's better to give more time to these stories which are so important. And again, I just love the show. I just want to say that like a million times over. I'm going to scream it at every person. I love the show. If you haven't seen Fellow Travelers, go watch the show immediately. And yeah, thank you for sticking around through this video. I know it was a long one again. It was pretty full on, but I think this show deserves that kind of time and energy. So, thank you so much for watching. As always, if you like the video, please like it. If you want to see more from me, you can subscribe. And if you want to see more of me just in general, you can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok, where you can see my makeup and special effects work as well. And also you can kind of see what videos are coming next. I don't actually know which one I'm writing or filming next. I haven't decided yet. I need to check my massive list in my notes app of commentary videos. As you can see, those are all things planned, so I hope you'll stick around to eventually see some of those. And yeah, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.